He hit seven figures on a random Tuesday morning. No countdown, no fireworks, just a number on a banking app that for years had felt more like a fantasy than a plan. He sat there for almost a full minute, not really feeling anything. No adrenaline, no tears, just a strange, hollow kind of calm, the kind that shows up right before you realize your life is about to look completely different, even though nothing around you has moved yet. He didn't call his parents, didn't post online. The first instinct was almost childish. He wanted to tell the people who'd known him before any of this existed. So he opened a group chat with the same 5 guys he'd known since he was 19 years old. "Guys, I think I just hit 1,000,000. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "No way, congrats, man." That was it. One text, then silence. By Friday, that group chat had gone quiet in a way it never had before, and what happened over the next 6 months taught him more about money and about people than any book, any course, or any financial guru ever could. If you're building wealth right now, stay with me, because this is the part almost nobody warns you about, and it will happen to you long before it happens to your bank account. We spend a lot of time talking about the mechanics of getting rich. Save more than you spend, automate your investing, let time and compound interest do the heavy lifting. Honestly, that part is simple math, and it's the easy part. There are entire channels, entire industries built around explaining that part to you. Nobody talks about what happens to your relationships the moment you cross a line your friends haven't crossed yet. Nobody tells you that success doesn't just change your bank account. It changes how the people who've known you longest start to see you, quietly, invisibly. By the time you notice it, it's already been happening for weeks, and by then, it's hard to even pinpoint when it actually started. This isn't a story about villains. Nobody in it is the bad guy. It's a story about what money does to the invisible agreements that hold friendships together, agreements nobody ever writes down, but everybody quietly relies on. So let's rewind, because to understand what happened to him, you need to understand who he was before any of this. 5 years earlier, he was splitting a 2-bedroom apartment just to make rent. He drove a car with 200,000 miles on it. In his friend group, he was the guy who always ordered the cheapest thing on the menu and pretended he wasn't quietly counting the tip in his head. If a friend suggested a weekend trip, he was usually the one asking if there was a cheaper flight, a cheaper Airbnb, a way to make it work without falling behind on rent. His friends knew that version of him. They had grown up with that version. It was a safe version, relatable, easy to be around because nobody in the group felt behind. Struggle was the quiet thing that bonded all of them together, even if none of them ever said it out loud. He started a small business on the side. Nothing glamorous, no viral launch, no lucky break, no single dramatic turning point. Just years of unglamorous, repetitive effort, waking up early before his day job, saying no to nights out so he could fix one more problem with his product, reworking a spreadsheet at his kitchen table at midnight while his friends posted vacation photos from trips he couldn't afford to join. For a long time, none of it showed. He looked the same, talked the same, still ordered the cheapest thing on the menu more out of habit than necessity by that point. And that's exactly why what happened next hit so hard, because on the outside, nothing had changed, only a number had. The morning it happened, he was half asleep, coffee in hand, refreshing an account balance before work like he did most mornings out of nervous habit. And there it was, 7 figures, sitting quietly on a screen like it had always belonged there, like it hadn't taken 5 years of invisible work to arrive. At first, the changes in his friendships were so small, he almost convinced himself he was imagining them. A joke that used to feel warm now had a slight edge to it. "Must be nice not worrying about money anymore," someone said, smiling. But smiles can carry weight you don't expect them to. At the next group dinner, he noticed people ordering things they'd normally skip, an extra appetizer, a second round of drinks, as if there was an unspoken assumption forming around the table. Nobody said it out loud, nobody had to. It hung in the air every single time the check came. He started reaching for his card faster than before, partly habit, partly because it felt easier than sitting through the silent tension of everyone waiting to see what he'd do. Then the invites slowed. Not dramatically, nobody cut him off outright. It was quieter than that. A text that used to come automatically now came a day late if it came at all. A weekend trip that used to include him didn't this time. When he finally asked about it, the answer was some version of, "Oh, we figured you'd be busy," said lightly like it wasn't a decision anyone had actually made. He wasn't busy. He was sitting at home on a Saturday night waiting for a message that never came. This is the part almost nobody prepares you for. It's not that people consciously decide to push you out. It's that they quietly stop including you in the version of their life they've decided you've outgrown, even when you haven't outgrown anything at all, and even when you'd give almost anything to still be included in the ordinary, unremarkable moments you used to share. One of his closest friends, someone he'd known since childhood, someone who used to be the first person he called with good news, started making comments that felt less like jokes and more like scorekeeping. "Must be nice. Some of us actually have to budget." Small sentences, delivered casually, almost affectionately, but they add up faster than anyone expects them to. And eventually you start bracing for them before they even arrive. And here's what made it worse. He started second-guessing every decision. Should he offer to pay? Would that come across as flaunting it? Would not offering make him look stingy, or worse, like he thought he was better than everyone now? Every choice, no matter how small, suddenly carried a weight it never used to carry. Ordering a nicer bottle of wine at dinner became a calculation. Mentioning a new laptop became a risk. He found himself editing his life in real time just to avoid making anyone else feel small. Then came the ask. It usually doesn't come directly at first. It usually arrives disguised as a hypothetical. Then came the ask. It rarely comes directly at first. It usually arrives disguised as a hypothetical. A friend mentioned he was thinking about starting a business and, almost as an afterthought, added, "You'd probably want to invest in something like that, right? I mean, you're set now." Another friend, half joking, asked if he'd consider co-signing something. A third simply started mentioning, a little too often, how tight things were for him lately, in a tone that felt less like menting and more like an opening. He laughed most of it off in the moment, but the message underneath was consistent and clear, an assumption that his success now came bundled with an obligation, that having more somehow meant he owed something to the people who had less, simply by virtue of having gotten there first. Then it stopped being subtle. One night, one of the five, the friend he'd known the longest, finally said out loud what had been sitting under the surface for months. They'd had a few drinks, the conversation had drifted toward money, and the friend looked at him and said, "It's just weird now, you know? You don't need us for anything anymore." Not angry, not really even accusatory, just tired and a little sad, like he was grieving something that hadn't technically ended yet. He didn't know what to say, because the truth was he still needed them, just not in the way money can measure. He needed the inside jokes, the shared history, the version of himself that existed only around these specific people. But he understood in that moment that needing someone financially and needing someone as a friend had gotten tangled together in his friend's mind, and there was no quick sentence that could untangle it back. That's when it really landed for him. This was never about the money itself. It was about the story his friends had started telling themselves about who he was supposed to be now that the number had changed. A story he never agreed to and never got a say in writing. This isn't just one person's experience either. People who study sudden wealth, Lottery winners, athletes, founders who exit early describe almost the exact same pattern showing up again and again, something often called wealth isolation. It shows up even in cases where the newly wealthy person hasn't changed their behavior at all. The isolation usually isn't caused by arrogance or distance on the wealthy person's side. It's caused by the surrounding relationships struggling to find a new equilibrium once one person's circumstances shift and the others don't. Everyone in the group is suddenly forced to recalculate, often without any of them realizing that's what's actually happening underneath the surface. Here's the part most videos like this one skip entirely because it's less satisfying than the simple story of jealous friends abandoning someone who made it. The truth is messier than that, and understanding it is the only thing that actually helps you if you're heading toward your own version of this moment. It's usually not your loosest friendships that struggle with your success, it's your closest ones. Because people who don't know you well enough don't feel the comparison. Your win doesn't touch their sense of who they are, because your paths were never close enough to measure against each other. But the people who've known you the longest, who remember exactly where you started, who maybe even believe they worked just as hard as you did, or harder, for them, your success isn't just good news, it's a mirror, and it quietly asks a question none of them wanted to answer out loud. Why not me? That question is deeply uncomfortable to sit with, and most people, instead of examining their own choices and circumstances in light of it, find it easier to simply drift, to quietly rewrite the story as he changed, because that's a far more comfortable story than the alternative. He didn't change, my circumstances did, and that's hard to look at directly. It was never really about the money itself. It was about what the money represented, a visible, undeniable marker of two paths that used to run parallel, suddenly splitting apart in a way that couldn't be unseen once it had been seen. For a while, he tried to shrink himself back down to make everyone comfortable. He downplayed things, avoided mentioning anything good happening in his life, even when people asked, quietly picked up the tab and never brought it up, hoping that if he just acted the same, nothing would actually change between them. It didn't work. You cannot out-humor a number that large. People already knew, and pretending otherwise only made every interaction feel more strained, not less, like everyone in the room was performing a version of normal that nobody actually believed anymore. The real shift came when he stopped trying to manage everyone else's feelings about his success and started paying attention instead to who actually showed up for him regardless of it. 2 people out of that original group of 5 never once made a pointed comment, never once treated him differently, never once made him feel like he owed an apology for doing well. They asked about his business because they were genuinely curious, not performing enthusiasm for the sake of the friendship. They still let him pay sometimes, and other times insisted on paying themselves, exactly the way friends always had before any of this happened. Nothing about how they treated him had moved an inch. The other 3 drifted, slowly, without any single dramatic falling out, just fewer replies, fewer invites, a little more distance in every conversation, until one day he realized months had passed without a real conversation with any of them. And strangely, that didn't feel like the loss he expected it to feel like. It felt like clarity. For the first time, he wasn't guessing who was actually in his corner. He knew. He also had to sit with an uncomfortable question of his own, one he didn't love asking himself. Had he changed at all? He went back through the months, honestly, looking for evidence. Had he started talking down to anyone? Had he stopped showing up? Had he made anyone feel small on purpose? He couldn't find a single moment. What he found instead was smaller and stranger, moments where he'd started flinching before anyone even said anything, bracing for a comment that might not even have been coming, apologizing in his tone of voice for good things happening in his life. In trying so hard not to be that guy, he'd started shrinking a version of himself that had every right to take up normal space in the room. That realization changed how he approached the friendships that did last. He stopped pre-apologizing. He stopped downplaying good news out of guilt. If something good happened, he said so, the same way he always would have before any of this started. The friends who stayed never blinked at it, and that, more than anything else, told him everything he needed to know about which relationships had actually been solid all along. Here's what he'd tell anyone building wealth right now, especially if you're on track to be the first person in your circle to actually get there. Here's what he'd tell anyone building wealth right now, especially if you're on track to be the first person in your circle to actually get there. Money doesn't reveal who your friends are. It reveals what your friendships were actually built on the entire time. If a friendship was built on shared struggle, shared circumstance, shared complaining about the same problems, success can shake that foundation because the shared ground underneath it has quietly disappeared, and there's nothing left holding the two of you together except habit and history. But if a friendship was built on who you actually are, the way you show up for people, the way you make them feel, the way you listen when it actually matters, success doesn't touch that at all. If anything, it tests it, and the friendships that survive that test become some of the only relationships you'll ever be able to fully trust for the rest of your life, because you already know they don't depend on your bank balance to stay standing. He didn't lose friends because he got rich. He found out, painfully but clearly, which friendships were real, a lot faster than he ever would have otherwise, and probably faster than most people ever get the chance to. If you're working toward your own first major financial milestone right now, your first million, your first debt-free year, your first house bought without help from anyone, understand this going in. The discomfort you might start to feel from people around you isn't always a sign that you did something wrong. Sometimes it's simply a sign that you did something first, and being first is a lonelier position than anyone warns you about. That's a harder position to sit in than most people admit, even when everything is technically going right, maybe especially when everything is going right, because there's no obvious villain in the story, no clean explanation, just a slow and quiet redrawing of who's actually around you. The people who matter will recalibrate and stay standing next to you. The people who were only ever comfortable with you at their level will quietly step back, and that reaction was never really about you at all. It was about what your progress forced them to confront about their own choices, whether they were ready to confront it or not, and whether they ever will be. Nobody warns you that reaching your first million might cost you the very people who watched you become one. But maybe that's not the tragedy it first appears to be. Maybe it's simply the truest test that money will ever put your relationships through. One that tells you faster and more honestly than anything else could, exactly who was standing next to you for the right reasons all along. If you're somewhere on this path yourself, here's what's actually worth doing, based on everything he wished someone had told him earlier. First, don't shrink to manage other people's discomfort. Downplaying your progress doesn't protect a friendship. It just delays an honest conversation you'll probably need to have anyway, and it teaches you to feel guilty for things you worked hard for. Second, don't assume distance means betrayal. Most people who drift away aren't villains. They're just struggling quietly with something they've never had to face before, and sometimes stepping back is easier for them than sitting with the discomfort out loud. Third, pay attention to actions, not words, in the months after any big milestone. Anyone can say, "I'm happy for you." What matters is who still calls, still invites, still treats a dinner bill the exact same way they always did. And fourth, don't rush to replace the friendships that fade. Let the space they leave stay open for a while. It's tempting to fill it quickly with new people who are impressed by where you've landed, but those relationships come with their own risks, since they only know the version of you that already has money, not the version that built it. If you've ever felt this, watched people quietly pull away the moment things started going right for you, you're not imagining it, and you're not alone in it. It happens to almost everyone who gets there first, and almost nobody talks about it, because it doesn't fit the highlight reel version of success we're used to seeing online. If this resonated with you, stick around, because next time we're going to talk about what happens on the other side of this story, how to rebuild a circle of people around you once you finally know who actually stayed, and how to make sure the next chapter of your life isn't lonelier than it needs